to our fourth episode of Season 2 of the 98% Life After Prison, a show dedicated to the roughly 98% of incarcerated people in North Carolina who will eventually be released back into society, often with little or no support. I am April Scales.
And I'm Judy Van Wyk. In each episode of our show, we focus on a theme related to incarceration and reentry. Today, we're talking about families. Did you know that half of all adults in the United States have a family member who is currently incarcerated or has been in the past? That's roughly 166 million people. And yet often those families remain invisible and isolated.
There's a saying that when someone is incarcerated, their family goes with them. Incarceration can cause the family to lose a major source of income, creating enormous stress, especially for mothers at home with children. Study after study shows that losing a loved one to incarceration can cause depression, anxiety, and a sense of shame that makes it hard to reach out for help.
And children often suffer the most. There are 19,000 children in North Carolina who have a parent who is in prison or jail. It's been shown that children of an incarcerated parent are at least 3 times more likely to have behavioral problems or depression, and at least twice as likely to suffer from learning disabilities, attention deficit disorders like ADHD, and anxiety.
Today, we're going to hear from a woman whose partner was sent to federal prison for 5 years when her children were 3 and 5 years old. We'll learn how this incarceration completely upended their lives and forever changed her relationship with him. Following our interview with Rachel Mascarenas, we'll also hear how her daughter Elle responded to suddenly losing her father.
That day, my children and I and Mark were playing a game of Operation, and he mentioned that his friend had came into town and he had to leave the game for a moment, so we were on pause. And Mark went to the front of the house, answered the door. The children and I hear, "Police, police, police." And so that's when the raid ensued, and there were like 25 agents on my lawn. And from there, we started a tailspin of a 5.5-year journey of Mark's instant arrest to his release. But then there was still reentry.
Did his arrest catch you by surprise?
I was totally shocked. I was completely shocked. Mark's arrest was unexpected, to say the least. And I was surprised by the magnitude. I couldn't understand why there would need to be so much manpower for someone as upstanding as Mark. I just felt like I was being slapped in the face over and over, although they were doing their job. A lot of people ask, well, didn't you know? Isn't this something you should have expected? But I was not privy to the ins and outs of what Mark was doing in that sort of business realm of his life. Early on in our relationship, he and I began dating in early 2005. So by this point, we had been together for 8 years. And early on, I believe I asked a question. I don't remember. What are you doing? Where are you going? He was leaving the house. And he said, "You don't ask me questions." And I was young. I was 20. And I said, okay. And I never asked him questions again.
How did your children cope with the fact that he had gone to prison? How did you all cope with that?
When Mark walked out the house, handcuffed, my children and I at that point were at the dining room table, and they said, "Where's Daddy going?" And I said, "Honey, he's going to timeout. I don't know for how long, but Daddy made a mistake and he's going to timeout. And just like when you go to timeout, Mommy still loves you and we're still going to love Daddy and we're still going to see him." And that was the only way I knew how to explain it. And I just said it. And they understood that to be true. Oh, okay, daddy's in timeout. Eventually it became jail. I remember that Friday. So it happened on a Wednesday. That Friday, sitting at a Ben and Jerry's, and I remember the dread in my stomach and just in my body, thinking, "Oh my gosh, how many weekends am I going?" And it was very selfish. Am I going to have to do this alone? These kids are 3 and 5. How many weekends? How will I get through this? It seemed immense, just unimaginable, like the duration. And at that point, we didn't even know what, I knew nothing about what the future held. I would say the biggest challenge of Mark being in prison was knocking the stigma off of my children, keeping their heads straight, making sure that my children knew that the situation we were in, yes, this is their father who created this situation, right? But it doesn't mean that you, child, made a bad decision. You're just along for the ride. And it was very, very important for me to get that through, because as I began to research and learn more about children of incarcerated parents, and these are the children that it's the school to prison pipeline or ACE, adverse childhood experiences. And statistically, my children were going to fail in life because 1, they had a father in prison. 2, they witnessed his arrest. They were there for a raid. And 3, it was drug involved. All of the odds were against them. And there was no way that I was going to allow that to happen. That was my biggest obstacle, was first and foremost, making sure that even knowing that my children, that there would be a stigma associated with the fact that they have a parent in prison, trying to get my children to understand that you did nothing wrong. You should have no shame. Yes, you still love your father. You don't get distant from him. And if anybody has questions, let them know. We're glad to answer those questions. And then I would say the second biggest obstacle was somehow getting Mark to understand that life didn't stop back home. So it was the stigma, number 1, and number 2, just getting Mark to understand that life is still going, and I'm juggling everything, and I'm seeing you every weekend, and I'm still trying to make it work here. It was a constant conversation about everything that I'm trying to do. And I'm not trying to put you on the back burner, but if you want us to come see you, I've got to do all this. When all of this happened, I wasn't naive to the fact that Mark worked at Duke full time. And yes, he had rental properties and he was turning a profit, with those properties. But we were living a pretty lavish lifestyle. I wasn't naive to the fact that A plus B doesn't equal C, right? I mean, I also wasn't allowed to ask questions or had agreed to that early on in our relationship. But I knew that there had to have been other things going on. And so I would kind of say that's a shame on me if I had anger towards somebody that I loved and that really was just providing for our family. And I wasn't gullible. I wasn't naive. I just followed suit and didn't ask questions like he requested. At the time when this happened, I was in school studying criminal justice at North Carolina Central, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? And my children were, my son was in kindergarten and my little girl was in preschool, and we lived a really a quaint life. I mean, just easy. Everything was very easy, so simple. if there was a problem or an obstacle, I knew that Mark would get it done. I could ask him and I knew the answer would be just so, that that's what I needed to do. And he was like a rock. I mean, he truly was the foundation of our family. Our life was flipped upside down. I didn't have that rock there anymore. I didn't have that foundation. I did, but any questions I had during our 20-minute phone call or 10-minute phone call, there was too much background for me to even get a reasonable answer or response from Mark. I had to depend on myself. And I think that, for me, I know there was so much growth in that individually. And that was actually something that Mark and I had always, if we had any issues in our relationship while he was home, the struggle was always, I'm in school, and it was almost thought of as like, oh yeah, go do your little school thing, and I'm here making real money. And so when things flipped, I matured. I was able to look for Rachel, find out who I was, and, in my identity. And there wasn't any shame in it or any embarrassment, because what I was doing in Mark's eyes was very minuscule compared to what he was doing.
Were you working?
I was working. I picked up a corporate job, and I was making really good money at that job. I also picked up a gig working the VIP suites for the Carolina Hurricanes, and I managed Mark's rental properties. And in all of that, our lifestyle didn't change, really.
You had these two young children who knew their father, but that's an awfully young age to have your father go to prison. And I would imagine it was hard to maintain that relationship. How did you maintain the relationship between Mark and his children?
I would say that Mark established a strong bond with his children, even at 3 and 5. The closeness. Family is so important to Mark. So he had already had a bond with these kids that probably a lot of fathers maybe never establish with their children. But then going forward, while he was in Durham County, we could visit him twice a week. So Sunday and Wednesdays we would go. There were little games that we would make up. Like there was a quarter game he would play, and there's glass, of course, at Durham County Jail. So Mark would put a quarter in one hand, or heads or tails. They were just little games they would play. They would write letters. Mark would call them as often as he could. He would email. The biggest thing I learned about the carceral system was that there were no definites. You hear so many different things. And what I realized after Mark actually made his way to his home prison was that there is no streamlined communication between the BOP to probation to then your halfway houses and reentry. There's no streamlined communication. So you can talk to one, they're not talking to another, and persistence is the only thing that you can be, as persistent in a very kind and respectful way. And that's what I did. I mean, I learned that if you wanted to get anything done, you had to really keep a log of all of your conversations, who you were talking to. That way you could refer back. And what I started doing was I copied everybody in. So I had your BOP, I had your probation, and then I had your halfway house. Yeah, in the federal system, everybody goes to a halfway house. At 2.5 years left is when your release plan starts, supposedly. For Mark, we started that release plan. So we went ahead, I found the release plan online, and I started filling it in. We also had his 2 letters from federally approved employers that already said that Mark had a job with them, in addition to his own business with the rental properties. So this is 3 jobs he already had secured. Probation had already approved our house. And so I had every box checked. And still, his case manager was like, this is great. We'll put it in his file for whenever that time comes. As we got closer, I'm doing this all over again because nobody knows where this file is. When Mark finally went to his halfway house, which was in Winston-Salem, and we're like, he could be in Durham. Why isn't he in Durham? But we were like, whatever, and so he talks to his caseworker and he provides the letters of recommendation that show, okay, he has 2 jobs secured. We have probation who have signed off. And what else do we need to do? And what the caseworker at the Salvation Army told Mark is that he needed to find a job. And Mark said, well, I have 2 jobs here that are not my own business. I have my own business. What do you mean I need to find a job? And his caseworker goes, you need to find a job here. And so we're flabbergasted. Why do I need to find a job here? Because it's $98 and, you get paid $98 a day for my head, for my bed space. It made sense. He was worth more being housed at the Salvation Army than being home, right?
You had become self-sufficient while Mark was gone and running the household. What was it like for him to come home?
Yeah, after being self-sufficient and running the household on my own, it was definitely a change having Mark come into the house. I think more so in the parenting aspect than anything, because our kids were now, 10 and 12, or no, 10 and 8, excuse me, 10 and 8. It was really difficult for Mark to take a seat and kind of observe and see what the dynamic in the house was. Oddly, right before he came home, I would say a few months, I began backtracking, thinking, okay, wait. I could use a few more months. Now this is too soon, because it was scary. It was really scary.
It was scary. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I was afraid of Mark critiquing me. So his release meant I know Mark's personality. He's got a very strong personality. I knew that he would come home, walk through the door, and it would be like, all right, I'm calling the shots now. Instead of him looking at me as an equal, I was afraid of losing myself again. I was afraid of, okay, I'm now beginning to be confused, even though he hasn't even gotten home. Now I'm confused about who Rachel is. And so there was a lot of my confidence was took a hit because I had so much anxiety about this. Mark has a very big presence. And so about this big presence that would be in our home, and how would it affect our daily grind, what we had known, to be our new norm. And that was really scary for me. How are my children's heads going to be affected? Because I felt as though I had raised 2 children that were, just really gems. They worked through a situation that the odds were against them, and yet they were doing well in school. They weren't, they had no behavioral problems. Just well-adjusted, good children.
You and Mark are no longer together. Do you think that's because he went to prison?
Yes, 100%. That's because Mark went to prison. We are not together anymore. Mark made the choice to leave, to leave the relationship pretty early on. I would tell other people that are going through having a loved one that's incarcerated, first of all, just that, yes, you're going to take it one day at a time, and let's not look to the end so soon, but to be vocal. If you have a question, ask. Lingering questions in your mind don't sit well. Write. Document your experience. Because as you go through, and this is what I did, as you go through this experience of having a loved one that's incarcerated, and this goes for children as well, I encouraged my children to write. Because there's no better person to tell of an experience as to one that's actually in the thick of it. And the only way you can capture that is if you write or you do voice memos and you document it. If you can write, if you can be patient, if you can offer grace to that loved one, there's nothing better, nothing more that's needed than just to really huddle together and to just support one another.
You know, one thing that strikes me about Rachel is that she refused to succumb to that sense of shame that so often goes along with having a loved one incarcerated. I think that's very cool. She is definitely one strong, very grounded lady. At the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that she was lucky to have the unwavering support of her parents and her extended family. And she's also fortunate that she wasn't living in a poor, drug-infested neighborhood where her children would be subjected to the daily trauma of poverty.
I think Rachel had a wonderful take on things, and because she was already with him, it could have gone either way. She could have been supportive of him, or she could have completely turned her back on him. But luckily, for the sake of the children, she remained in his life, providing him the support that he needed and keeping the bond of the family together.
Yeah, she did it for the children, and I think she really loved him. It's just they grew apart.
Yeah. And it happens a lot of times when space can either bring people together or divide them.
Next, we're going to hear from Rachel's 13-year-old daughter, Elle, who was just 3 years old when her father was arrested and sent to prison.
My name is Elle Ford, and I'm 13 years old. I have a brother. His name is Aubrey. I have a mom and a dad, and a little background information. My mom was there for me my whole life, and she went through the same as me and my brother, about how my dad went to jail, and I was around 3 and my brother was 5, and basically he kind of missed half of my life, and it was just a really confusing situation.
Do you remember anything at all about the day that your dad was arrested?
I do, and I'm actually really surprised because I was only 3 years old, but I remember it's called the big room, and it's a really big room. It's kind of as big as the living room, so it's the second living room, but basically my mom took me and my brother in there, and we locked it because that was right when the cops were at the house and my dad was getting arrested, and he was trying to open the door, but my mom knew it was just not safe and he was going to get arrested either way, so she just kept him out. And I remember just sitting there, and my mom was holding me and my brother, and she was just holding us. And then I remember going out, and I saw my dad on the floor, had his hands behind his back. I was just really scared and anxious because I didn't know anything that was going on.
What did your mother tell you about your father's arrest and about why he was going to prison?
So I think she always told me, but it was a little bit hard for me to understand. But when I got older, she just said do y'all know when dad's going to come back? And we would just say how many years he's going to come back. And it was only 5 years. And she told me that he just sold drugs that made him go to jail. She didn't really get into detail. She just did it in a mature and calm way. And that's basically how I knew. And I knew he was going to come back in just a few years.
What was it like when you were little growing up without a dad?
It felt like different from other like people at my age. I was like, they're lucky to like have their dad like living with them. Like if I was at school and I saw their dad, I was like, dang, they're lucky. Like they don't know. But also I knew that he was going to come back one day, and it was hard. Like I changed a lot because of it. I like turned really toxic, and I would just be really different and mean towards people, which was a really bad habit. It's just like growing up without him, it was really tough, and it was really confusing, and it made me confused and angry at that time, and I just couldn't handle it well.
Did it make it hard to make friends?
Not really. My friends really understood it. Like if I just told them like, oh yeah, my dad went to jail, they'll just be like, oh, like, okay. Like they didn't really care or judge me that much. And it was pretty easy to make friends. It just, took off a lot of like opportunities of like doing like stuff, because I would always think about him, and I would always be like, I want him to come back. I miss him. And like, I just like want my dad to be on my side. And I couldn't even think while doing anything. I would just be like, I just want like my dad here. I just don't want to do any of this, anything that I did.
Did you stay in touch with your dad? Did you hear from him often while he was in prison?
Yes, we would visit him a lot. And for birthdays, we did go and we took pictures, and we would always like bring cupcakes for like whoever's birthday it was. We would have background photos. It would have like decorations, like just a little layout, because we couldn't go anywhere. We had to stay in the jail. It was really nice, like jail. It was pretty clean, and I really enjoyed seeing him. And whenever it was close for him to come home, he always came over on weekends to our house.
I know you were just 3 years old, but were you close to your dad before he left?
I do remember that, like, I think I was close. He's always, like, loved me since I was born, and I do remember him always, like, being there for, like, every, like, moment. We were close, but, like, we got closer when he went to jail because of, like, everything that has happened.
What was it like when he came home?
It was really different. I felt a little bit uncomfortable, not because he was there, it's because it changed like my whole life. I felt like, because it was a lot different when it was just me, my brother, and my mom. So when he came back, I was just really confused, and I was a little bit sad because I was like, I'm not used to you here. Sometimes, even though I really wanted him to be back, sometimes I wish like he didn't, because it was just, I was so like out of like the picture of him and me. Like, it was so confusing because I wasn't used to that. I didn't have him in my life for all those 5 years that he was gone. So it was really confusing at first, but I started to warm up to him. It was really hard because whenever I'm just like in my room, I'm just like, I went through that and I felt strong for it. And it's crazy that I went through it. Like, if you went through this, it would just feel unbelievable. Like, it didn't happen. But I'm also happy that I have a bond with him now, and it was hard, but I'm glad that like it helped also, because I feel like me and my dad wouldn't be as close if he didn't go to jail.
Elle was very poised for a 13-year-old. I was very impressed by her interview, by her take on things. And it's not often that you get to see the child's perspective and hear how they actually feel being separated from a parent when they're incarcerated.
Yeah, and it was clear that she was traumatized, definitely, by her father being sent to prison.
Yeah, I hope that she's able to work through that trauma and doesn't carry on into her adulthood.
It sounds like she's got a good handle on what she's gone through and is in a good place right now.
Yeah, I wish Rachel the best.
Likewise. Rachel and Elle's story demonstrates how hard it is to stay connected with a loved one who's locked up, and how incredibly important family support is for the incarcerated individual. You know, I'd love to do a show devoted to the perspective of people who have been incarcerated and have them share what they went through with their family while inside. But speaking of family, April, you gave birth to your son Colt not long after you were incarcerated. Can you talk about that?
Giving birth while incarcerated and under armed guard was a very different experience. There's no one there but you. The staff are there to monitor you, not to necessarily support you. I did have more lenient staff, probably just due to the severity of why I was there. But, it was very scary. You have to go through the trauma of giving birth, the trauma of thinking about what will happen after you give birth, and then after you give birth, going back to prison and just trying to live the life the best way you can while you're incarcerated.
And you had to give up your son.
Yeah, you can't keep them. In North Carolina, they don't have a program where you can keep your child up to like 2 years. So on the third day, I did have to hand Cole over to a family friend of mine.
And she raised him, I understand.
She did raise him to the best of her ability. She and I went through some challenges. She went through some things in her life, family, financial issues, which was kind of a trickle-down effect and to Colt's life. But a lot of times people don't realize when they raise your children that's it. They're not their children. They belong to someone else. And a lot of times there's a conflict. I went for a period about 4 years where I didn't get to see or hear from Colt due to the challenges that she was having in her life, and from about 14 to 18. And that was probably the worst and longest prison time of my life.
Wow. I get the sense that having Colt gave you a reason to keep fighting and just keep persisting and trying to look to the day when you would get out.
Yeah, he was solely the reason why I decided to get up and put one foot in front of the other day after day, even on the days that I wanted to throw in the towel. He was the sole reason for my existence.
And you two are very close now.
Yeah, when he turned 18, he came to visitation, and he's never left my side since. We've pretty much talked every day since then. He went into the military, and he's still contract military and moved to several different states, but he visited me when he could in there, and we do see and talk to one another a lot now that I'm out.
I really look forward to meeting him one day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's the coolest kid ever.
Well, that's our show for today. Join us for our next show when we are introduced to a training program for therapy dogs taking place in 3 of North Carolina's prisons.
That sounds cool. Meanwhile, tell your friends and colleagues about the 98% Life After Prison. And if you want to get in touch with us by email us at 98%.lifeafter@gmail.com. That's the number 98, the word %.lifeafter@gmail.com. See you next time.
See you next time.